Good morning, and welcome to Mountain Standard Time. I'm your host, Nathan Gita, and today I'll be speaking with Aaron Gunn, independent journalist and, of course, an agitator in general down in Victoria and throughout British Columbia, who goes and investigates what's really behind the stories. And then a little later today, joining us physically in studio, actually, will be Stuart Parker to kind of round out our week and help us see both near and far what happened in the news. As always, I recommend that you subscribe to us on Facebook as well as YouTube. And finally, of course, take out a subscription at the Western Standard. We don't get a big check from the Liberals regarding our journalism. So if you'd like to support independent journalism, please feel free to send us some cash. Big news out of Alberta this morning. Members of the United Conservative Party caucus are actively calling for Premier Jason Kenney's resignation. If you'd like to learn more about that story in detail, log on to the Western Standard's website. We'll have live updates throughout the day as this drama unfolds. For what it's worth, I predict that Mr. Kenney will not survive this. I'd say it's more like an insurrection within his caucus, a rebellion, but you could also call it a coup. I must admit, Premier Kenney's situation saddens me. As previously mentioned, I interned with him in Ottawa many moons ago while doing the Laurentian Leadership Program through my alma mater, Trinity Western University. The man I knew then was intelligent, good-humored, and generous, even to us lowly office serfs. I remember him actually pushing a cart around on Fridays after quitting time, to be clear, and all the things he'd been given as gifts that were liquid and fermented or distilled would be poured out in small drams, and everybody would have their choice of stuff that was, $300 bottles and $10 bottles, whatever they were, and everybody would have just a small drink at the end of the week, and he would pour them himself, and he would chat with each one of us individually. And that was pretty special. And I really believed at that time he'd be prime minister someday soon, that he would succeed Harper. It was an incredible achievement, his uniting the right in Alberta and going on to win a majority. Even Harper had to suffer minority parliaments first. But as fate would have it, Kenney was elected in 2019, with Alberta still suffering from the oil crash 5 years earlier, as well as COVID-19 looming on the horizon. It's always darkest just before the dawn, they say. But throughout 2020 and now into 2021, challenges only got darker for Alberta, for the rest of Canada, for all the world. Add to this that Kenney seems attached to staff that are giving him bad advice or taking trips in the middle of a pandemic, while also imposing some of the harshest lockdowns on the province best known for an independent spirit, like its sister Quebec, but we'll get into that another time. And suddenly, old Jason looks pretty vulnerable. It is said that the premier actually admitted he wanted a new base. That's probably a sign it's time to go. There is only one cardinal rule in politics, particularly if you don't want to be like those craven, sick operatives that we call the Liberal Party of Canada. Never betray the base. The Grits don't really have a base. They have a consensus, but they trick other groups into voting for them, and then they betray those situational allies all the time. Veterans, First Nations, unwed mothers, it doesn't matter who they are. They will trick them into voting for them and then leave them on the stoop like nothing else. If you want politics done differently, never ever act like that. In Alberta, Kenney was elected by people who were sick and tired of the PC's entitled culture, that is to say the Progressive Conservatives beforehand, and Rachel Notley's NDP spending, tax hikes, and soft socialism. And of course, her pivot to big oil. She left behind little oil and she went to big oil. Even as the pandemic was starting out, Premier Kenney needed to think through his own political survival, which meant he could not treat Albertans in a way that they would not accept. Today, he is reaping those fruits. The best path forward was to make recommendations, beef up protocols for hospitals as well as old folks' homes, and pray that everything worked out. If Kenney had followed those rubrics, for all the heat he would have caught from his fellow premiers and the feds, maybe the world, he would have survived in his role and perhaps even proved that lockdowns were ineffective. He'd be in line to be the next PM, especially considering that Aaron seems to be fumbling that away. But it wasn't to be. We'll leave that topic now and we'll pivot back to BC issues, but I'm genuinely sorry for Mr. Kenney's predicament. God help you, Mr. Premier. Miss you, Kenney. Sorry about that. Well, we've got Aaron waiting in the wings here. We're going to bring him on right away, and we're just so thankful to have him. Of course, it's Aaron Gunn, live to us from, I suspect, Victoria. But why don't you tell us what's happening down in the lower mainland, Victoria, BC, and what's gone wrong with the world, Aaron?
Would be a shorter answer maybe to tell you what's going right with the world. It seems like these days there's one issue after another. I mean, every day they're tearing down a new statue. Another industry is getting sabotaged. People are losing their jobs. People are losing their businesses. And, we just keep racking all these problems up on the nation's credit card. And that bill's going to come due one day, and it's going to be a big one.
Let's start from kind of the local area and move our way out. Right now on the island, I mean, there's the homeless situation in Victoria. I know that you talk about this a lot on social media and you discuss it a lot, that clearly the city has lost control of the situation and there's no leadership. But not so far away either, and we can talk about that in just a moment, is what's going on in Fairy Creek. And the kind of bizarre intersectionalism in reverse that's happening, where First Nations people who want to make a living and are doing resource development are now being countered by non-Native people who are protesting against their livelihood. So why don't we talk about some of those things?
Yeah, sure. Where'd you like to start?
Well, I mean, let's start from Victoria and work our way outwards. I've always liked visiting Victoria in the sense that it's a very nice place to visit. It's very pretty. I did park once in near somebody's residence in a parking zone, but it wasn't supposed to be overnight parking. I couldn't go anywhere else, and they had a traffic bobby called on me. But somehow, parking in the wrong zone, that would get people called on me. But somehow, being a colonist of Beacon Hill Park, that's fine. So I should have parked there, I guess.
Yeah, no, I mean, I grew up in this city, obviously still live in this city, and it's amazing what's happened to it. They've turned, what was once such a beautiful and pretty much crime-free city into areas that are a complete disaster zone. Every day there's somebody else that gets stabbed, that's bleeding out in the middle of one of the downtown streets. As you alluded to, Beacon Hill Park, which is kind of our central park here in Victoria, has been occupied. They recently have moved them out there, but there was a tent city there for about an entire year where people were being stabbed. There was, I believe, an axe murderer was taking shelter there at some point. Some of these stories almost defy belief. But now what they're doing, their latest thing is they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayers' money, and they're going to try to warehouse all of these people and think that the problems are going to go away. I don't know if the same things happening in some of these other provinces, but across BC right now, the government's literally going up and just buying up hotels. I think they've spent about $1 billion buying up hotels, both in Victoria and the Lower Mainland. And they're just trying to warehouse the problem there of drug addiction, mental illness, and crime. And they're going to turn these hotels into just crime hotspots that are going to affect all the communities and the tax-paying, law-abiding citizens that live around them.
One of the things that people talk about all the time is gentrification and pushing people out. But is this not whatever the opposite of gentrification is? Is this not something that if people have a stake in their part of the city, their part of the country, especially considering the cost of housing, they just got into a house, so they did have to buy in a part of town that maybe wasn't as expensive as other parts, and that's life, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. You can make a good neighborhood out of it. But if suddenly the real estate values are going to change because of moving people around, basically by coercion, that seems rather unfair to the average taxpayer, to the person who just made a capital investment in their lifelong investment, the thing that's going to carry them on the most.
Well, you're 100% correct. And it's also, I mean, the parks in these neighborhoods are being stolen from the people in the communities. They're setting up signs here in Victoria that are, like almost have this feel good imagery around them, and it says like, be careful, make sure to watch for needles before playing at the park, as if that's the new reality and that's the new status quo that families are just supposed to put up with as part of life, which I think is completely unacceptable. So you have people that grew up in these communities, as you just mentioned, made huge investments in housing in these communities, and now they can't take their kids or grandkids to the park. They can't feel safe walking home at night. And they've had, as you alluded to, their number one asset take a massive hit.
The opioid crisis has killed more people in British Columbia than COVID-19 has. And yet, of course, all we're talking about is COVID-19 recently with the opioid crisis, which is directly connected with homelessness. I mean, there was also a tragedy in your hometown there of Allie Thomas dying of an overdose, clearly from fentanyl. And she was 12. What is going on here? Like, why can't our government get a handle on this situation? This seems to be completely out of control.
Yeah, well, I think you go back. So we rewind the clock a little bit. 20 years ago, there was this so-called political consensus, which are always dangerous things, because they stifle the ability for people to come up with new innovative ideas. And you get this groupthink that takes hold. And 20 years ago, they came up with the idea that harm reduction, so safe injection sites, needle exchanges, all these things, was what's going to solve the drug problem. And back then, in the early 2000s in Vancouver, they called it the crisis, the drug crisis. There's about 178 people dying, 170, 180 people dying each year from drug overdoses. Last year, it was 1,700. So clearly, the strategy is not working. And yet you listen to the politicians, and what do they want to do? They want to double down on the exact same strategy, increasing harm reduction. That's their narrative. It's not that harm reduction hasn't worked; it's that it hasn't been tried in its fullest and most imaginative forms. And of course, now what they're doing is they want to set up these, basically their heroin vending machines placed throughout Vancouver and Victoria, and I believe a couple cities out east. And that's their solution to the problem. But no, it's getting out of control. As you mentioned, it's killed more people than COVID. These are people that are, obviously they're ending their own lives, but they're just, I'm sure, wrecking lives of their friends and families and communities and neighborhoods. We need to get them off drugs. And the solution isn't to keep handing them free heroin or free hydromorphone or whatever heroin-like substances are out there.
And it only seems to be getting worse from there. I remember in Prince George, like, we actually did have a handle on our poverty situation here and the homelessness situation here. The fires changed that a bit because they evacuated everybody to Prince George. So they got people out of Williams Lake and out of various other places that were threatened by the fire, and they brought them to Prince George. And then, of course, the people who didn't return home were the transient populations of the various communities that they had evacuated. So we've had an increase in our homeless population, which that's fine. Like, I mean, if we have to bear more of that and then work our way through that, that's not the problem. But there has been also an endemic of crime and drug-based death in Prince George, and there's real problems with this. And there seems to be a lack of leadership here too. It seems to be just a deficit of leadership throughout Canada around this question. Nobody wants people to die from drug overdoses. Even somebody who's totally unsympathetic to that situation doesn't want that to happen. What does it look like turning that around, Aaron?
Well, I think there's a couple things. I think if you look at, so some of these issues can't be separated from each other. So a lot of people will ask me, like, what do you think the solution is for homelessness, for example? But I do think drug and mental illness gets thrown in there as well. But I think drug addiction and this rampant drug use is the number one problem. How do you deal with that? Well, I think you got to deal with a couple things. I think one of the first things is that there are people that are genuinely mentally ill. I'm sure you've seen them. Whether it's wandering the streets of Prince George or downtown Vancouver or here in Victoria, these people need to be in like a hospital getting help. And we've closed a lot of those institutions over the past 30, 40 years, and the so-called mental hospitals, and those need to be opened back up for that subset of individuals. Number two, there's people that are shooting up drugs openly. Heroin, fentanyl, smoking crack cocaine, whatever the case may be, that shouldn't be socially acceptable. You hear a lot from the far left about how we have to destigmatize drug use. But I mean, the reason why it's stigmatized is because it's wiping out thousands of people every year. Like, there's a reason. It's like, it's not something that should be seen as okay to be pursuing in broad daylight. So I think what you need to do is you need to really fund and implement a strategy that focuses on getting those people off of drugs so they can be integrated back into society, can become tax-paying members of society. And I don't think that should be negotiable. And I think third, in all of these tent cities, in these homeless encampments, as much as certain people on city councils want to try to sweep this under the rug, the truth is crime is a major element. And they use these encampments as kind of shelters to run whatever illicit operations they happen to be involved with. And the big problem with that is that I know police officers, I'm sure you do too, people that work as Crown prosecutors. It is a revolving door system. I mean, these people go in and they come back out. They go in, they come back out. Half the people you see getting arrested now are out on parole. They get a 10-year sentence, and by the time there's an appeal and parole, they're out in a couple years. Plus, getting double the time served before they get sentenced. They get double time. So I think there's huge criminal justice reform issues as well that need to be dealt with. So those three issues combined, I think, need to compromise the first step. But what they're doing now is doubling down on a strategy that by any metric has failed spectacularly, is not going to be good for taxpayers, and I don't think it's going to be good for the province or the country.
Well, let's move out a little bit from Victoria, then a little bit up the island, and we're going to head over to Fairy Creek. As far as I can tell, the situation there is, again, it's a deficit of leadership, and of course, a complete twist of things where supposedly, I'm a status First Nation. On my card, it actually says that I'm an Indian because that's what's still on the card. So I don't know why we're using that word as a slur or saying it is a slur. It's like other slur words. It still says it. When they change the department, they change my card, I'll stop saying that word. But the point is that as somebody who's right of center as a status Indian, I've definitely been censored over the years. I've had people come at me and be very upset that I don't carry the narrative of our times that's all about victimhood. And then you have a similar situation going on here in Fairy Creek, where people who are trying to develop a resource, be independent, financially independent. This is what we've talked about for years when it comes to Aboriginals and the poverty that can happen on reserves and how we alleviate poverty. Suddenly, some non-Aboriginals show up and try to stop them from developing their territory. What's going on over there?
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. So you have this group of environmentalists who claim to be standing up for First Nations on unceded land, et cetera, except that the local First Nations, the bands that are there, both the hereditary and the elected leadership, have all told them to leave. They're actually involved, and they've partnered with the forestry industries. They actually have a little sawmill in the First Nations community. Obviously, it's and people forget, like, look at a map on where British Columbia's First Nations are living. These people are working and deriving their wealth from the tech sector or downtown, Vancouver's economy. The vast majority of First Nations are living in communities that are dependent on the resource sector. And in BC, that mainly means forestry and mining. And so, the First Nations leadership kind of across the board, I believe there's been 3 bands now that have basically told these environmentalists to beat it and to stop with this hypocritical narrative. And, that I don't know how these groups get away with it. They just ignore the First Nations. They somehow spin it back into these bands have been corrupted by the Indian Act or whatever, like, even though they're elected by the people that actually live in these communities. Like, these people can rationalize anything to themselves. It's quite something to watch.
I was told once that I had internalized my oppression, that I'd clearly become one with the colonizer or something, like, I love John A. Macdonald, and I know you love John A. Macdonald. I think John A. Macdonald actually treated us pretty well. It was actually the Liberal governments that succeeded him that tried to make things worse. It's the same thing that happened in British Columbia. The Conservative governor of British Columbia, as much as he wasn't going to give the franchise to them, he did try to make a fair deals with the First Nations around here. And then it was a Morta Cosmos who comes in and is like, no, I'm a good progressive. I'm just going to treat these people like complete crap. And John A. was shocked when he got here that there were no deals put through. How does this narrative get so twisted?
I think the biggest problem is a ignorance of Canadian history. It's obviously not one that plagues you, but I'm sure talking to everyday people, you'll notice this. Most people don't know much about Canadian history. Now, I mean, we're not knocking it out of the park with exciting and real tenuous periods in the 1800s. I think, but to be honest, that's a credit to people like John A. Macdonald and Wilfrid Laurier, who you look what happened in the United States. Obviously, they had a civil war. You look what happened there with their indigenous populations. I mean, what happened up here? They called it the medicine line, the border between Canada and the United States, because one of the reasons was a lot of those First Nations that were nomadic at the time. When they came across Canada, that was the safe place. That was where they could kind of seek safety and shelter and support, as opposed to the United States. So I think that because there is that ignorance of history, it allows activists with ulterior agendas to come in and distort it and seed ideas into people's minds. And you saw that even earlier this week in Charlottetown, PEI, where they passed this motion. They said, okay, we're not going to tear down this statue of Johnny MacDonald, but we need to erect this basically anti-Canada monument, talking about all the terrible things that John A. MacDonald did. He was the architect of residential, like just bought into the narrative completely. And none of it's true. And I know when I read this and I see the city councilors, like, it doesn't take very long to read John A. MacDonald's biography. It doesn't take very long. Like, I don't know why people in the media and politics aren't educating themselves on literally the core of Canadian history and how things actually developed. You obviously know exactly what you're talking about. You referenced it. Johnny MacDonald was not some caricature racist from the 1800s. He was certainly not the policies that came directly after him in the next 30, 40 years were more racist than anything that he was pursuing at the time. He generally wanted to, his biggest crime was that, he wanted to assimilate everybody because he thought everybody should be equal regardless of race and be part of Canada. And so he wasn't, so he was, he gave Black Canadians the right to vote. He granted most Indigenous Canadians the right to vote, which was later repealed by the Liberals. He did all these incredible things and was friends with many First Nations individuals. And yet he's characterized in this way.
As a white supremacist, as if that was ever a thought in MacDonald's mind. It's amazing. Again, like, I think in a sense you said that we on the right, sometimes we're just not getting ahead on the narrative, right? The left is dictating the narrative. The right is they're just playing catch up all the time. They're still arguing. They're arguing about something that the left won 20 years ago, and the left is on to the next thing. I think this is one of those things. It's just where the right needs to just kind of counter and be like, no, you know what? Like, we're going to make sure that we have a clear idea of who John A. MacDonald is. I don't care if we have to support a documentary. I don't care if we have to get our own, conservative version of Netflix that preaches the good word on true history when it comes to Canada. It's that we just seem to have so much against us, whether it's the CBC and the other mainstream media and everything else, and the Liberal Party of Canada with its consensus and its natural governing status. Their narrative is what goes. And for some reason, conservatives just can't seem to fight back or unite enough to fight back.
I agree 100%. It's a huge problem. I mean, it's the one thing is that obviously there's people that are leading these campaigns, for example, against Johnny MacDonald, who are doing it very deliberately, who believe in a kind of a post-nation state world, who believe that to help that agenda proceed forward, it helps to basically tear down Canada's history and the ethos behind the country and some of the foundational values and stories, because countries are built on stories. So I think that's why they've targeted him. Look, like Wilfrid Laurier obviously was prime minister, continued and repealed the right to vote to Aboriginals, Chinese head tax increased 500%, et cetera, et cetera. Was prime minister for, 15 years or something like that. I mean, no one's even talking about Wilfrid Laurier. Not even being brought up. Why do they keep focusing on John A. MacDonald? It wasn't his policies. The reason why they're focusing on John A. MacDonald is because he founded the country. And to these individuals on the radical left, they think, and this is so important, they think that the founding of Canada was a travesty. It was not a positive. It's like this. It was the original sin, was the actual existence of the country in the first place. And they resent that. And that's why they're targeting him. It's not for any of his particular policies, because he didn't, I mean, residential schools started happening before him. They weren't mandatory till after he died. They continued up till the 50s and 60s. And I think technically there was one open till the 1990s. So it's nothing to do with his policies. It's about what he represented, and he represents Canada. And they fundamentally believe that Canada was not a legitimate country that should have never been created in the first place.
Do you think that maybe a huge part of the reason then that Canada just can't seem to build anything, Canada can't get anything done, can't finish a pipeline, can't get its dams built on time. The ships are a complete debacle. Is that have to do with our narrative lacking? Right, we're seeing this now even with the United States, and they had a gas shortage on the East Coast, but they're also talking about shutting down Line 5 to the East Coast. Though, admittedly, a lot of Western sovereignists who watch this channel probably be pretty happy about that for a little while and let them eat it for a little while. But nonetheless, like, what happened to Canada's vision? Why are we essentially a vassal state of America? Why don't we have our own story?
Well, I mean, you can look at issues in the Canadian media. I mean, what you just said is 100% accurate. I think the number one thing is there's been a lack of political leadership in Canada, though, for the last 50 years at least. And that lack of political leadership, I think, has led to a lot of the problems we have. I mean, look, we're always going to have problems telling our own story in the age of the 24/7 news cycle and the internet, when we're living next door to the United States, which is a cultural behemoth. And, you know, both speaking the same language and having similar historical roots in Great Britain. But we haven't done a good job of telling our story about how we're differentiated from the United States, about how our paths diverged, obviously significantly in the 1700s and through the 1800s, and, you know, the historical realities that we can be proud of, whether it's the two world wars, or whether it's how we dealt with indigenous people. In fact, that's another thing, is like, if you look at what happened in Australia and the United States, or really almost anywhere else in the world, we should actually be proud about how we worked with indigenous people. And for sure, it wasn't perfect. And for sure, and this is the other thing that drives me crazy, for sure, if you apply today's standards back 200 years in the past, things don't look so good. But I mean, do you really want to compare where we are today to 200 years in the future? Because I don't know where they're going to be at as far as values and how they govern things. And maybe we're going to look like dinosaurs. So I think that's a ridiculous, I mean, that's not how you're supposed to read and understand history. You have to look at it through the context of the time and what's happening everywhere around the world. And by any reasonable comparison, Canada was a phenomenal place, ahead of its time. And John A. Macdonald was, you know, the central figure that brought that all together.
I'm not sure if this is a fair kind of point. We hadn't discussed this beforehand, but it just occurred to me that at one point I heard a rumor that you had thought about seeking the BC Liberal leadership. Is that still happening? I haven't heard any updates for a little while.
Yeah, that's still happening. I mean, so what's going on there is, obviously normally these races are 4 or 5 months. Mm-hmm. Here they made the vote in February. So I've got, as you know, got my own brand going on and content that's being put out there, and plus with COVID, and I don't think anybody cares about something this far in advance for a party like the BC Liberals. So it's still something I'm seriously considering, but I'm not going to be making moves until, you know, middle of June at the earliest. So I think there's a huge amount of time, and I'm just going to keep doing what I do best, which is communicate to British Columbians on the issues that matter to them. So, and look, the BC Liberals are a party that's in need of serious renewal. They're in need of serious new ideas. They have a lot of baggage. They barely stand for anything anymore. Last election was a complete embarrassment. It was like a choice between the NDP and the NDP Light. Andrew Wilkinson had no charisma, didn't present any new ideas, didn't present any new alternatives. I'll tell you something, Nathan, like this was something 6 months ago I wasn't even considering. This couldn't have been further from my radar. But I sat there during the last election, and it was embarrassing. Like, I watched that election debate. It was embarrassing. It was like, these are the choices that were being presented. Yep. I feel like I know British Columbians. I feel like there's space for a different voice here. So we'll see how it goes. But I think it would be nice. I think British Columbians would relish the opportunity to have a real choice in an election and actually debate some new ideas.
And that's another aspect of what's happening here in BC, is there is this deficit of leadership. We had this election come to pass. The opposition party might as well have been campaigning for the party that was trying to take power. It was all nonsense. It was complete nonsense, and there was just this complete lack of vision for the province. Now we're getting into a whole other level of things, with apparently the electoral boundaries are going to be changed for places like where I live, and supposedly we're going to eliminate a bunch of ridings north of Hope, beyond Hope, as they like to call us from Vancouver. they have to remember that, of course, it's beyond hope the other way as well. So they're going to eliminate some of our ridings and shift all of the demographics down into the lower mainland. Like, if we don't have a provincial Senate, how are we supposed to have proper representation for the regions of BC where all the gas comes from, all the timber, all the hydroelectric, but they don't want to give us a voice?
Yeah, the regions that are providing the tax revenues that build the hospitals and the schools and other communities. Yeah, I think it's not surprising. The NDP, the one thing I will say about this is political parties tend to kind of gerrymander in their advantage. So this isn't super surprising, but we'll see how the details get worked out. But yeah, of course it's concerning. Now, that being said, I think, the BC Liberals, with the right leader and the right set of policies, should be able to appeal to a broad cross-section of British Columbians. I think there are people that are fed up with the direction that things are going, that live in Abbotsford, that live in Langley, that live in Nanaimo, and that live in Prince George, as you said. So I don't think that, while I basically agree with the premise that you're saying, I don't think that should limit the ability to actually offer an alternative in the election and campaign strongly.
One of those big issues would be, of course, making housing more affordable in this province. Things have gotten a little bit out of control here. I mean, it's funny, like when I make complaints from here, people are like, "Oh yeah, right, $400,000. That's Langley 15 years ago. You've got nothing to argue about." But I'm like, well, that's still $400,000 in Prince George for a BC bungalow that was built, when they were still building some of the dams up here. And on top of that, it's got 2x4 walls and it was renovated. Like, that's nice and everything, but that was a doctor's house just 10 years ago. I'm not that old. Like, it's like, I don't know what happened to my city, but something's gotten completely out of control.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things happening. I mean, on the national picture, obviously inflation, I think you see what's happening with lumber prices and oil, steel, copper, these kind of things. That's kind of an overarching issue about, we can't print money forever and expect there to be no consequences. So I think that's part of it. But generally speaking, look, it's not fair to British Columbians who grow up in their communities, who grow up in their neighborhoods, and are basically forced to leave them because they can't afford a place to live. I mean, I'm 31, so it's right around myself and my friends are trying to enter a housing market right now. I mean, you're taking a massive risk. You don't know what's going to happen. It's huge amounts of money. These interest rates, you're borrowing just huge amounts of cash. And I don't think it's very risky. And it really is a little bit of a house of cards. Not to kind of beat a dead horse with that analogy, but it's look, I think there's a couple things also, like on the speculation side of things, and I've said this. We can't be, speculation plays a role in the stock market. It plays a role in financial markets, right? Because it injects capital and liquidity where you need it. But in housing markets, where people start speculating and people start gambling, especially people from outside the country, you're really playing with people's lives. So that can be an issue. Now, I think it's been overblown a little bit, the issue that it's playing, but I think it needs to be taken seriously. The other side of this coin is that there's a lot of municipal governments that have made the building process to match housing supply, to get projects built, so cumbersome. Tens of thousands of dollars in regulations, huge delays to even get projects approved. I checked before I came on to chat with you today. The Empire State Building was built in just over a year, which was the tallest building at the time. I mean, if you tried to do that again in Vancouver, you'd be lucky to get that completed in a decade, I think, with all the regulations you'd have to go through with the municipal governments. So I think that there is, you got to come at it from a couple different angles. But one of the things is you got to, and I will say, I'd be completely frank with you, there is an issue happening in British Columbia at large and in Vancouver, Victoria specifically, where the secret's out a little bit. You got a lot of people moving here from Alberta, from Saskatchewan, from out east, just because of the climate. Obviously, for all of the incompetence in government, it's an incredibly beautiful place to live. So I think you do have a huge influx of people as well, and you're going to get bidding wars, and the price of housing is going to go up. But I think that there's like so many issues in our society, It's not that the government needs to find a solution in some cases, that the government's actually the problem. And if they remove themselves a little bit more from some of the regulatory moves that they've been making to restrict housing, building, and development, you'll see supply rise and you'll watch those prices level off.
Yeah, and get to a natural plateau.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that's always been an issue, and it'll always be an issue, affordability and that sort of thing. But at a national level, and I'm kind of pivoting now towards the federal Tories and what's happening there, the election that's coming down. I mean, again, even there, whether we're talking about COVID or any of the other issues that are plaguing us right now, again, there seems to be a deficit of leadership. The Tories don't seem to be doing a very good job with opposition against the Liberals. They seem to have lost their step. They had a really good time with the WE scandal, did really well with Jody Wilson-Raybould, did really well with some parts of the vaccine rollout and that sort of thing. But ever since, Aaron decided that we're going to have a carbon tax in going in the face of his own supporters, right? The Coalition for Life deciding the policy of the Conservative Party of Canada, telling him rejecting roundly his proposal at the convention floor. Yet he goes and says that there will be a more complicated, less transparent, and apparently kind of Canadian tire money system for carbon taxation. I mean, what are the Tories doing? Are they trying to lose the next election?
Sure looks that way. Look, I think the issue that they're making, and O'Toole and his team around him, is that, I'll tell you, they need to get some of the people that were on the team during the leadership that have left since. But they're making this classic mistake that is just made by the political establishment over and over again, and that is that they think Canadians view themselves on a linear political spectrum, and they say, okay, if the Conservatives are here and the Liberals are here. If we just move a little bit more to the left, we'll capture all this vote and then we'll win the election. And of course, most Canadians don't see themselves on a linear political spectrum. They just want common sense policies that make sense to them and that respect taxpayer dollars. And, they're not caught up in ideology and left and right and all these kinds of things. Of course, people that are heavily involved in politics are, but most people are not like that. So these decisions to move left don't end up kind of giving the electoral fruits that the people that make these moves think that they will. And it happens over and over again. And what it actually ends up backfiring, because it makes the leader, because just as important as the policies for people, actually, I would say more important is the credibility and the authenticity and the honesty of the leader. And everybody can, I'm sure people see this Aaron O'Toole Green Bucks plan. So some people hate it, obviously the Conservative base. A couple people might like it. A lot of people might be indifferent to it. But what it does show is it seems inauthentic. Doesn't seem credible. It seems like a flip-flop. And of course, it makes you wonder, as I'm sure it makes many Conservatives wonder, they might disagree with the policy, but maybe more importantly is they start doubting Aaron O'Toole's commitment to the Conservative principles that he ran on in the leadership. And that's what I think is actually more important. And if you just look like some kind of weather vane that's going to start pointing in different directions depending on how the wind's blowing, that's not a quality of leadership, and it's not something that I think voters will get behind.
To the point of the carbon tax as well, I mean, British Columbia has had a carbon tax for years. That hasn't done anything for our fires. It hasn't appeased the climate gods. I've kind of taken to a mode of calling it all a bit of a theocracy, especially now that we have COVID. It's just, it really does seem like there's this high priestly class that runs everything. It's like a technocracy. It's more inhuman than any other theocracy almost on planet Earth, except for maybe Iran. And the fact of the matter is that it doesn't appeal to human beings on a human level and to people on a people level. And finally, with what's going on with the federal carbon tax and even the question of the pipeline, especially Line 5 out of Michigan there and everything, what are we doing? Like, we know that we need energy. This is a cold place. We need energy. Even Victoria gets cold. It gets, a couple of snowfalls a year. Everybody forgets how to drive. It's a bit of a crazy time. But like, we need energy. We must have energy. And until we get to that green future, whatever that's going to look like, God knows how much that would cost and what kind of raw materials and rare minerals it would take. Like, why do people think that we could just somehow switch off the taps or turn off the lights? Like, that's not how it works.
100%. And I mean, those that think we're going to solve climate change by taxing Canadians into taking the bus are woefully misinformed and are going to be incredibly disappointed as China continues to build new coal power plants every week. Yeah, I think that it doesn't make a lot of sense. I think it makes a lot of people feel good about themselves that they're doing something. Because as you said, when you look at the statistics and you look at the facts, it's not doing anything. And as you said, and I want to make another point, because you just mentioned that we need the energy, right? Like, it's cold here. There's going to be cars powered by gasoline for decades into the future. It's just how it is. But the other thing is that the world is going to continue to need this energy. So there's the one question about ourselves. There's the second question that I think is even more obvious, believe it or not, which is that as long as the world needs energy, the natural follow-up question is going to be, where do we want the energy to come from? Do we want it to come from Russia? Do we want it to come from Iran? Do we want it to come from Venezuela? Or do we want it to come from Canada, where we have the best environmental regulations in the world, where we plow a lot of that money back into healthcare and education, where we have human rights, high-paying, quality jobs, and a resource that's only going to be around for so long, mathematically speaking. So I think it should be a no-brainer. I mean, the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline is finally almost complete because the government bought it. It's going to be hilariously over budget. I mean, we're going to be only the government could lose money on an oil pipeline, but they're going to find a way to do it.
Or pot.
Exactly. But they'll find a way to do it. Just watch. But when Justin Trudeau, I don't know if you remember this, when he made that decision to say, okay, well, we're going to let Trans Mountain proceed, but we're going to cancel Northern Gateway, even though it got all the environmental permits, passed the NEB's regulations, everything was sound, being built by Enbridge, which is a world-class company, one of Canada's world-class companies. We have all the supply that we're going to need. What happened a couple years later? Keystone XL canceled. This is the exact policy. When John A. Macdonald, it's the exact same thing repeating itself. When he had a choice to build the National Railway, it would have been cheaper, a lot cheaper and easier to cut down through the United States. And if anyone's ever driven across the country, you'll know how this works. It's a similar distance, but the land that you're building through is a lot different through the Canadian Shield through Ontario than cutting down below the Great Lakes through the United States. But if you did that, you would have been capitulating on our sovereignty and basically made the entire country beholden to the U.S., which back then was also a credible chance that they wanted to invade Canada. Part of their whole kind of North America belongs to them mentality at the time. Now, what's going on with these pipelines is we canned Northern Gateway for no apparent reason, no logical reason, instead became completely dependent on the completion of the Keystone XL pipeline, which was then canceled by the incoming Biden administration for no apparent reason, just to appease part of his base. But he doesn't care what Trudeau's doing. Now you've got this disaster with Line 5, which would have been completely a non-issue if they built Energy East as well. And again, we should be an energy superpower, and instead we're a laughing stock, being concerned about or getting our oil supplies to our two largest provinces. And I mean, the Line 5 thing is hilarious. Like, if this happens and you have Canada, which I think is the third largest reserves of oil in the world, and we have gasoline shortages in our two largest provinces, that will be the epitome of the failure of political leadership. And the truth is that Trans Mountain might be done the expansion might be done in a year, but Northern Gateway should be being finished right now, and Energy East should have already been built, and they're not, and we're losing billions of dollars, I would say, each and every day from those two pipelines not have being built, and that's a significant issue.
It's a huge issue. It's a huge issue, especially as we pile on debt, which we're then going to have to pay interest on, which is then going to go to somebody else, and our kids and their kids and their kids are all going to have to pay for it. It's just insane. One of the aspects to that kind of rears its head pretty quickly. I mean, there's news out of Alberta today that Jason Kenney is actively being called to resign by his own caucus, but throughout the West there's this agitation, and of course the Western Standard does a lot of this around this question as the question of sovereignty. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but where do you land on the question of sovereignty? Do you think that that's a way forward for the West? Do you think they just need to threaten it to get what they want, or do you think we just need to fundamentally reform Ottawa and keep federalism alive?
Yeah, I don't think. I mean, I'm a Canadian. I definitely consider myself in the Canadian patriot class, if you were. I look at the history of Canada, the country that I grew up in. I love this country. I don't think there's significant cultural differences, which is normally what leads to a breakup or a separatist movement, like in Quebec, that does have its own culture for anyone who hasn't lived there for a period of time. But so what I view it as a massive failure of political leadership that has disproportionately hurt the West and disproportionately hurt Alberta and Saskatchewan. Look, I know lots of, and this is why I'm not really on board. I 100% understand the frustrations, but I think that entire separatist movement, unlike separatist movements in other countries, if you magically waved a magic wand and got rid of Justin Trudeau and you brought in a sensible, common sense government that respected the West, I think that's all that people want. I think that's fundamentally what people want. And the separatist movement is born out of the fact that people are watching the situation and just can't even see it's the political leadership is the lack of common sense options is so dramatic that people are ready to throw in the towel. And I totally appreciate where they're coming from. That's for sure. Obviously, I'm doing everything I can to try to turn that around internally. But yeah, it's a huge problem, but people need to step up. And obviously, that's why I was disappointed with O'Toole's carbon tax thing, because I feel like there's a lot of people in Western Canada that just like, here we go again, like another person from Central Canada who makes promises to the West and then throws us under the bus. But I thought Harper was a good prime minister. That wasn't that long ago. He was there for
feels like a century ago.
Feels like forever, yeah. Feels like forever ago. But anyway, so that's my point on that. That I still think this country, like I really am a Johnny MacDonald conservative who he was the one that brought the West into the country in the first place, connected the West, delivered to the West, from the '85 rebellion to building that railway to bringing British Columbia into Confederation, all of these kinds of things. I mean, he was kind of that original person. But we need someone with that kind of imagination to really stand up and take that on, and not be afraid to take on the Toronto elites, the Montreal elites, the Ottawa elites that so often dominate policymaking in this country.
Absolutely. I must concede here again. I didn't mean to put you on the spot there. I am rather ambivalent around the question of sovereignty myself. I definitely think that it's a way of maybe getting some things that we want by threatening it. I think Quebec has done very well with that, and if you could get some of the deals in the West that Quebec has gotten for itself, I think that would be great. But in general, I would like the borders of Canada externally to remain the same. Internally, I think there could be some rearrangement, right down to the fact that even earlier, as we were talking about the fact that there's going to be a rearrangement of our electoral boundaries inside of BC, I think that there might come time for us to start treating BC like kind of the way Switzerland gets treated with its cantons. It's, different sections of BC need to have their own say. Vancouver can do what it wants to do, and other parts of BC need to be able to not go along with it, whether we're talking about graduated licensing or the SkyTrain and subsidizing that. That's all great when I'm visiting there, but I don't want to pay for it when I'm away, and so there needs to be a rearrangement. But I think that's Canada in general. There needs to be a rearrangement. Everybody feels like they're paying for each other's stuff and none of their own, and they're not getting a fair deal. Maybe as we kind of close here, Aaron, you could tell us just a little bit about What's kind of on the horizon for you? What are you thinking about? I know that you've done some documentaries here, there, and everywhere. You're talking. You're trying to bring people real discussions, break through the political correctness, and give people an honest look at things. What's kind of on your agenda for the next little while?
Right. So I'll be announcing in the next couple of days, but I'm doing a second season of my show, Politics Explained, which aired in the fall, which are 20-minute deeper dives into different issues. The first season, we did things like the rise of cancel culture, meeting the protesters that oppose pipelines in Canada, that kind of thing. Really deep dives that interview a lot of the key players and key experts on various topics, and then going into the field and exploring those issues directly. We're doing one on forestry and what's going on at Fairy Creek. Already started filming that. So that's going to have my plate pretty full for the next month. At that point, as we move that into post-production, I'm going to take the serious look and make a decision on provincial politics here and the BC Liberal leadership, and we'll see where that ends up. And we'll see where the province and country is at that time. My thing has always been, I love doing what I'm doing now. I don't have any particular interest in getting into politics, but I'm just so exhausted sitting on the sidelines and watching a huge number of British Columbians or Canadians, whatever the case may be, not have a voice. I feel like they don't have a voice. I feel you guys are doing a great job at the Western Standard, because the media is one of those the mainstream media is another one of those places where a huge number, possibly you could say a majority of Canadians, don't have a voice. So I think it's important to start countering that in the media, in politics, all these different avenues. It can't be one or the other. And I'm just kind of always keeping my eyes open for where I feel that I can do the most good and be the most effective at advancing those ideas. So that's kind of what I'm up to right now. And definitely wake up every morning and feel like I'm on the front lines of this fight. And I'm sure you're the same way. So your first question today was, reading through these news headlines every morning. It's always something. It's always something every morning. Something insane is going on. So
something insane, completely insane. The Charlottetown thing with John A. Like, it just. And maybe that's a perfect place to kind of conclude, Aaron. What if you could give one message to people who are totally don't know what to think of John A., don't know what to think of the country he founded? What would you tell them? What is the one thing they need to know about that man and about this country to have some pride in it and move forward?
Without John A., the country wouldn't exist. So if you think that Canada, through its history, its 150 plus year history, has been a net positive on the world, has it been a net positive on your life, and a net positive on the vast majority of people that live here, if you think it's been a force for good, if you think everything on balance, it's been something that we can be proud of, then we should be proud of John A. Macdonald, and we need to remember his story. And if you believe all of those things, I think he should be celebrated, and people should find, but don't take my word for it. There's biographies been written about him, even the internet, which is a misleading place at times. If you spend an hour or two, you can get a pretty good idea of the man that he was. But that's what I would say is he is, single-handedly, unlike many other countries in the world, like Germany, France, Italy, that were somewhat predestined to become nation states. Canada was not, and it took the leadership of one man in particular in Charlottetown to bring the 4 original colonies together, and then rope in the rest over the subsequent decades. So, if you think Canada is a good place, you've got John A. Macdonald to thank, and I think that should be celebrated.
I completely agree. And, I do think that there's whatever might need to be reformed in this country, whether you're looking at it from the right or the left. The fact of the matter is that we're very blessed to have this country, and hopefully we can preserve it and make it a better place, a more equitable place for everyone, where people do feel like they have a stake in it and a voice, for sure.
100%.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Aaron, and we hope we have you on again soon.
Thank you for having me. Would be happy to come back anytime.
Absolutely. We'll follow up with you. Well, we're very thankful, of course, for Aaron being on with us today. And now we get to do the whole thing that we've done a couple of times on the show. So we're going to walk everybody through it very briefly here. This is a live show. We're not Tucker Carlson. We don't have the My Pillow guy to cut to here. We are live and we don't have any commercials. So unfortunately, we are going to have to take a quick break. We're going to just cut the feed for a moment. It'll still be live, don't worry. And we're going to rearrange things here because we're going, having someone in studio. Our guest here today is going to be Stuart Parker. Stick around for that. We're just going to be gone for probably about 1 minute. All right. And just like that, Stuart Parker has appeared. Look at that. Look at how we did there. That went pretty well. Stuart, it's been a bit of a week. There's gas shortages in the East Coast. There's threats of Line 5 being shut down. There's, of course, it's a little ways back now, but there was that terrible overdose in Victoria. And here locally, we might have our boundaries completely changed in BC. What is happening? We're going to bring that a little bit closer to you.
All right, much appreciated. Well, it's interesting. I was talking with my friend Art Vandenberg, who really tracks the fossil fuel industry, and he was talking about, what's broken with Line 5? What's causing the problems? And the answer is, it's not the part of the physical infrastructure you think. It's the computer system that does the billing. So the gas is there, but the company won't release it until it can bill for it. And right now, the billing software is down. And I think that really speaks to our
time, doesn't it?
It's like, oh no, it's broken. What do you mean broken? Well, I can't charge people money for it, so it doesn't work. I don't know. I might install some software to make some guesses, make some deals with some local authorities about how to average out the billing and move forward. But we don't live in that world. We live in a world where the gas line is taken hostage, and then the person who owns the gas line takes us hostage to deal with the hostage situation.
That's brilliant, right? Like, why don't just hold a knife to yourself? You've got them. You've got them. They can't take you away from you. You're the perfect hostage taker of yourself.
Exactly. So it's all coming together. We often think that things aren't working when, in fact, they're working exactly as they were intended to, exactly as they were designed, which is don't move the gas until the money flows.
Exactly.
And that's, that hasn't gotten any less true since Frank Herbert wrote Dune, and they kept repeating, the spice must flow, the spice must flow. That's all that's going on here. But it is unfortunate that we have so much in North America dependent upon a privately owned pipeline system. I thought Aaron Gunn was really on point when he said, look, if this is vital infrastructure, socialize it. Put it in the hands of the state so the state can move it. Or you can argue it's not vital infrastructure. It's just a thing that people use to make money. And then we can take a different position, and then people can go. The other really sad warning I saw associated with all this was people taking plastic bags to the gas station.
Yeah, that was... I didn't really know what to make of that. That was one of those moments where I sat there and I was like, oh no.
It's one of those not even wrong situations. It's too wrong in too many ways at the same time.
Exactly.
All I can say is let's remember, folks, that between May and September, Easterners are not freezing in the dark,
Yeah.
right? That stereotype we have from Peter Lougheed in Alberta was lovely back when Eastern energy consumption peaked in the winter, which it doesn't anymore. It peaks because air conditioners take more power than heating systems do.
Well, because you're having to convert it 3 times in order to get to the
You're
same
not just
thing.
converting it, right? You have to heat something up in order to make something colder, right? It's contrary to, you're working against entropy. And so
the laws of science.
I would say don't cry too hard for the Easterners. They can turn off their air conditioning and get a hibachi and cook the stuff that's thawing in their freezer.
Yeah, of course.
I think that's where I just can't get that excited about energy crises during the summer. I mean, I lived out east. I hate that Mississippi air mass. I just sweated all the time. Sweating was like my job, and my PhD was my side gig. But anyway, but sweating is what you sign up for if you're from there. So
no, I remember visiting just the Great Lakes,
folks.
just the southern Ontario. I was in Toronto. I'm just visiting there for 5 minutes. I was like, I need to leave. I got to get out of here.
Oh yeah. Well, let me tell you, when I moved to Ontario to do my to go back to school, I woke up the first morning and it's like, why am I awake so early? It's 5:30 a.m. and everything is so hot and sticky, and I'm on the floor of this mostly unfurnished apartment, and I turn on the CBC, and the first announcement is that there's been a coal-fired generation air inversion, and people with respiratory problems shouldn't leave the house. And I thought, oh God, this sounds bad. And then there was an extreme heat warning stating that people with another set of health problems shouldn't leave the house. And then they announced that Hydro One hadn't bought enough power that day and everybody needed to turn their air conditioner off to avoid brownouts. And it's like, well, welcome to the center of the universe.
Exactly.
This is the place that Canada is run from. I don't know what to make of that.
It's almost, you know what? I think that it was said best by somebody who's actually quite left wing, a friend of mine, Jeff Brom, who said that the real reason that the Fords need to be left in charge of Ontario forever is exactly what they deserve. They should be king of Ontario in perpetuity.
Well, the thing is, like, I was living in Toronto in 2010, might have voted for Rob Ford in the civic election, to be perfectly honest, given the array. I mean, he was up against George Smitherman, otherwise known as Furious George, the guy who was responsible for the provincial e-health scandal, where he tried to get a single electronic patient record put together and somehow lost over $100 million. So he was up against Rob Ford. And the thing was, a lot of people on the left, if they lived in the outer communities in Toronto, both went out and voted for Rob Ford, and before he was even declared elected, started organizing to save their local library, because they knew he'd come for their library, and they liked their library. But as much as they loved their library, they hated the smug pricks of the Laurentian elite who had been running their city more. And the prospect of embarrassing them by electing Rob Ford was more attractive than a public library branch. And you really do start to feel that way if you live in Ontario. Like, it's pretty weird to go somewhere and I'm just this rube from the West who should not be taken seriously. And they have different reasons for not taking everybody seriously. And eventually people get tired of it. It's sort of like some jerk keeps parking their, BMW in your garage. And you can't really do anything about it. The cops aren't going to help. They're with the guy with the BMW. The only thing you can do is burn your garage down in the end.
That's
out of spite.
Self-immolate. If you kamikaze hard enough, you will carry the day.
Yeah. So, and also, I think what Doug Ford, like, if John Horgan had been handed the same set of economic and epidemiological conditions as Doug Ford, he would have done much worse. We have to remember that Doug Ford had better sick leave, more proactive lockdowns, did not do things like declaring sport fishing an essential service on day 28.
Stuart. It is.
I'm all for survival fishing. Sport fishing, not essential. So you look at the measures Doug Ford took, it's just that he was running a jurisdiction like New York. It was the primary airport in the country, primary migration reception point, primary industrial center. But if John Horgan and Bonnie Henry's rules had been enacted in Ontario, you'd see a way higher body count than Doug Ford produced, which proved to me that fundamentally, at the deepest level, your average bank robber is a lot more compassionate than your average banker. I feel like Doug Ford just was out of his depth. Like, he had just come to loot the province.
Well,
And,
yeah,
like,
I mean,
and-
like, that's what he's here to do.
Yes. And he was like, oh no, these people are dying. Oh no. Oh, damn it. And you could just see it as like, I think that whole, the Ontario COVID response is like an American heist movie where the bank robber gets into the bank and then he discovers that nobody cares if the hostages die. And then he's like, oh, geez, maybe I'm looking after the hostages now.
Exactly.
I don't even know. I just came to rob the bank. Just let me take my money.
I just wanted the money. I didn't want things to get complicated.
Yeah.
But this is just it. Like, it's like, I mean, whatever one might say of the Fords. I mean, the Ford family is what it is. It's Ford Nation. I mean, they get to call themselves Ford Nation. That's a whole other thing. But ultimately, it truly, I think you've hit it on the head there. Like, he was there to kind of be a brute and a bully. But even a brute and a bully must have some kind of empathy because they know when they're not being respected, so they know how to dish out bullying. Whereas you go off to Bonnie Henry and John Horgan, it's like they're on cloud whatever. They're not on this planet anymore. They don't care.
I don't think they're even the good guys in their own story. I really struggle to decode those folks. So, like, normally everybody's the good guy in their own story, but I think Horgan's the bad guy in his story.
He's not good enough yet. I don't know, but like, it could even be. Like, I mean, he could be a way better socialist because he's not much of a socialist. No. He's not much of a social democrat. He doesn't. He could be Christy Clark's, like older brother if he wanted to be. Like, he's not. Like, where's the policy differences?
Yeah, there's regime continuity, except in two areas, and I'll give him props for those two areas. He put some brakes on the amassing of houses in BC. He did create some small financial penalties for people who are collecting homes as investments. And fair enough. He probably slowed down that house appreciation a little bit. At least he did something. The other thing is that he has undone the NDP's 1990s welfare policies. So the welfare policies that he was part of the government that enacted in the 90s, he's realized that they were horribly punitive towards poor people and has mostly reset them to where they were under social credit. So,
which weren't exactly the friends of poor people.
No.
And somehow the NDP did worse.
Well, actually, I would argue that social credit, I had a very, so one of my political mentors is George Gibault, who was, social credit's research director for 16 years. And George and I were talking about, like, well, why was public policy so good when you had, like, according to the C.D. Howe Institute, social credit was a disaster. Mm-hmm. Because the people in government had very few degrees, they had very few credentials, and the businesses they owned were pretty small, generally. Mm-hmm. And your two typical social credit candidates were the guy who runs the used car lot and the guy who runs the open line show. And right, every little town used to have a used car lot and an open line show. And the thing is, if your open line show was going to work, everybody had to call in and expect fair play, whether you agreed with them or not. And
like what we try to do here.
Yeah. So whether you agreed with, so the guy hosting the show had to be fair to everybody in the community to keep that show running. Mm-hmm. Same thing with the used car lot. You needed everybody to be getting their used car there. You couldn't afford to lose your indigenous customers.
Nope.
You couldn't afford to price people who were unemployed out of having a beater car to get around town.
Yep.
You couldn't do that. Everybody had to be able to come across that lot. And while that's not socialism, that's a heck of a lot closer to socialism than what the NDP became, which is the other party, pretty much.
Well,
the
now the
administration.
Now a single mother's used car, the taxes she pays on it subsidize the lawyer's Leaf mobile and his Tesla.
Oh, look, man, I got a friend with a Leaf. The people with Leafs have a hard road to hoe. He had to build, because Leaf is, so one of the things the big auto industry folks did is they're not that thrilled about getting off fossil fuels. It means a lot of redesign. It means a lot of sourcing of different commodities. It means depending on supply chains that are further away. So they typically chose to make really bad electric vehicles. Now, props to Elon Musk in the sense that he made good electric vehicles. But for Chevy or someone, it's not even your objective to make a good EV. Your objective is to say, we have an EV, please don't too many people buy one. Because that inconveniences us and everybody else. Just weirdos.
Have to retrofit all these factories and change everything. And
well, and also with the old Leafs, the chargers don't work with the more powerful chargers. They heat up, and then the car thinks it's overheated, and then it shuts down for 8 hours and strands you wherever you were. So anyway, my friend Art has designed an adapter so that the new chargers don't destroy his Leaf. We're going to be testing it on the 25th. It took us 17 hours to get to Vancouver in a Leaf last time. We're going to see how much time this new charging adapter cuts. But it's, I wouldn't go so far as to say, I mean, look, everybody who's in a vehicle is rolling in one kind of subsidy or another because, you know, the one thing John Horgan has done is he's increased fossil fuel subsidies to the highest they have been in the history of British Columbia. So we're paying for a lot of extraction for the fuel. It's just that the subsidy formula is different. And in my view, if we're going to subsidize personal vehicles, which I really question at all, then, you know, subsidize the ones that are solving a problem. I have no idea what problem the average car is solving other than the failure of the government to provide decent mass transit. That's mostly what our fossil fuel subsidies subsidize. Well, that and the corporations that extract the fossil fuels and put the money in a sack. But
bank robbers that don't need hostages. They just rob and they go.
Yeah, but I'm much more a fan of like old tech that would address this. Like
light rail?
Put the damn train back on the BC rail line. Like you don't even need to do a new thing. Buy a Bud car, stick it on the line like it used to be before, you know, we paid CN to take the rail company off our hands at a 91% subsidy. So
what did happen with BC Rail? What happened there? I've never gotten a straight answer as to what happened to BC Rail.
Well, it's pretty simple. The Campbell got in on the promise of not privatizing BC Rail.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, though, his party was ideologically committed to the privatization of any profitable Crown asset.
Mm-hmm.
This is the idiocy of privatization. Nobody sells off a part of a government that isn't making the government money. Why? Because you couldn't sell it. No one would buy it.
Mm-hmm.
So the only parts of the government you can sell off in a privatization deal are parts that are bringing cash in and replacing tax dollars. So you sell off BC Rail or some other asset, you know, it's like selling the furniture to pay the mortgage. It's a very silly financial move. So the Liberals were constrained. They couldn't just sell it. So, of course, they came up with the idea of the 1,000-year lease.
1,000 years?
Yes. Well, 999 and 364 days, I think, technically. So they then went out there and said, all right, who wants to have the old BC rail line for 1,000 years? And now the assessed value of the line.
They have some estimations on the second coming of Christ, I guess.
Yeah. So the estimated cost of the line was, the estimated value was 1.1 billion. So they sold it for 90 million. Or 90 million. And so huge discount. Justified how? Well, we're not really selling it. We still own it. We've only lent it to somebody for 1,000 years. So then Omnitrax and CN get into a competition for that. And at this point, folks in the bureaucracy it's pretty clear that there's a lot of self-dealing going on. And there's a lot of explaining to do about the sale. And Kevin Falcon, Gary Collins, all kinds of fairly high-level people look as though they might be implicated. But fortunately, there were two low-level officials who had leaked information to the losing bid. So Bassey and Verk ended up doing time for leaking information to Omnitrax. Nobody has ever really investigated the CN sale and how the decisions were made, how Collins and others were involved. And one of the things I thought the NDP would do, given that they've created the Cullen Commission and whatnot, would be they used to be big fans of there being public assets. It's like, well, look, this sale was so screwed up, people did time.
Maybe we should look into that.
Surely we might have some legal standing to get the line back, given that it was sold off in such a greasy way. But that was ruled out as soon as the party took office. They were worried about another capital strike. And so we also have to look at the Cullen Commission in this context. We think that this is about the government going after criminal wrongdoing in the Solicitor General's office under Rich Coleman, shielding casinos from money laundering investigations. Let's remember, though, that the point of the Cullen Commission and of commissions generally, like people have this, a lot of people on the left like truth and reconciliation commissions because they don't know what they are or what they're for. What these commissions are for typically is legally immunizing people so they can testify before the commission. The commission's primary function in a situation like this is to shield people from criminal penalties in exchange for telling the truth. That's how government commissions work. So if you actually think there have been a bunch of crimes and a bunch of people should be punished, you want to hand that to a special prosecutor and the cops. You don't want to hand it to a commission. But I think one of the reasons for this is we've got to remember John Horgan's chief of staff, Jeff Meigs, right? They were both officials in the Glenn Clark government. Horgan was a lifelong New Democrat. Meigs had spent most of his life as a Communist Party of Canada organizer. It's important, though, to understand that the Communist Party of Canada, for the whole duration of the Cold War, was just a dodgy scheme for getting beach vacations. So it was just that people couldn't afford a vacation, and you get a free one in Cuba or the Ukraine at the beach if you were a high enough level communist. So
that sounds like a pretty good reason to join. Does that still carry today for Cuba?
To an extent. Actually, well, the problem is they've got worse holiday destinations. Although when and of course there are two different parties handing out the holidays. So the Communist Party can hand out Cuban holidays. They used to be able to hand out Ukrainian and Russian holidays. Obviously, they couldn't do that anymore. But then the other party, the Marxist-Leninist Party, they were the people who sided with China. But then when Nixon went to China, they decided they were the Albania Party, which was crazy, except that until you've been to an Albanian beach. The beaches in Albania are bloody incredible.
It's the Mediterranean.
Yes, but sadly, the regime in Albania has fallen now, and the Marxist-Leninists were quite hard up until Robert Mugabe went totally crazy. And now you can go on safaris to Victoria Falls if you're a Marxist-Leninist. So anyway.
Reasons to join.
But Jeff Meigs and John Horgan, right, 2001, they're out on their ear. They're not in government anymore. So Meigs becomes associated with Larry Campbell the former coroner, former senior police officer, very popular. And he becomes the chief of staff of Larry Campbell when he's mayor of Vancouver. And one of the first things he does is he starts helping out his old pal, John Horgan, who is what at this point? A lobbyist for the casino industry.
Interesting.
So Horgan and Meigs cook up this plan for a waterfront casino. And it's great because Meigs gives a speech to the annual general meeting of the Coalition of Progressive Electors explaining that we have to have a waterfront casino because of the false consciousness of the working class. So, don't say communism was good for nothing. Beach vacations and casino promotion. So Meigs, and now Larry Campbell remains. And so Larry Campbell is the primary point of contact for Horgan's business. And it's Larry Campbell sits on the board of the Great Canadian Casino. It's Larry Campbell's casino that did most of the money laundering. And so you sort of wonder, the NDP might have any number of reasons to want to immunize people from prosecution in exchange for their testimony. Because nobody has the real story of how Meigs, Horgan, and Campbell fit together. We just know that Larry Campbell, although he's a senator, doesn't feel particularly obliged to testify or cooperate with the police.
Interesting.
So, and it's also a great example of New Democrats and Liberals working together.
Yeah, exactly. And one party, one opposition, the people.
Yes.
one group of people to punish. I think what's interesting with all of that is precisely that. One thing that queued up for me was a lobbyist for the casino industry. It's like being a lobbyist for tobacco. Like, doesn't it just sell itself? Like, who do you need a lobbyist for these things anymore? It's like, I'm here to help the government make a ridiculous amount of revenue off of the least of these and to enslave people. So why don't you just give me my golden paycheck already and I'll walk?
Oh yeah.
What do you have to sell?
It's quite funny. There was a great line in Trailer Park Boys where Julian's saying to Ricky, he's dead, Ray, stop going to the video lottery terminals. It's like, hey, Julian, the Lord made the video lottery terminals. He made all of creation. He says, look, that's not what's going on here. The government put those video lottery terminals at the bar because they don't like giving out welfare checks and they want the money back. And that's about the size of it, right? These governments conceptualize these things as cost recovery measures. But we actually did in the 90s have something called a gambling expansion strategy. And when I was running in the White Rock by-election in 97, I said, well, should we have an alcohol expansion strategy too? Like, why stop there? Now, the supposed justification for government casinos and government VLTs is that we're preventing people from going to Vegas. This is a very...
No, they didn't really write that down.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the same logic as pipelines, so this is going to get ugly in a minute.
Okay,
so the supply... Basically, their idea is that the laws of supply and demand don't apply to gambling. That there's a finite amount of gambling the population of British Columbia will do, and no matter how much you increase or reduce the number of casinos, the ease of getting to them, the proximity of bars to the casinos, all that stuff, that we're just going to gamble exactly the same amount no matter what. And then it's just a matter of, well, we should get our share. The more casinos, the more VLTs we put here, the less money will go to Vegas. Now, we all know that the laws of supply and demand are real. That if you reduce the difficulty of doing a thing, and if you increase the supply of that thing, more of it will be consumed. Now, let's think about the rhetoric we're using to sell LNG. China will consume exactly the same amount of energy no matter what. It doesn't matter how much you increase the supply of fossil fuels, it will be flat. So we're just replacing dirty coal with clean LNG. There's no way more natural gas will be consumed just because there's twice as much of it on the market and the price has collapsed. That's nonsense. We all know you put more stuff out there cheaper, more of it's going to get consumed. Adam Smith has never been proven wrong on that point.
Even Marx said so.
Yeah, that's just common sense. But you can see how Horgan could easily slip into the rhetoric of we're replacing coal with a clean energy source because he'd already been hawking the same logic. Now, of course, you can't actually measure flights to Vegas from a jurisdiction. So we know that these arguments are completely false, that the more gambling you put in a jurisdiction, the more flights to Vegas there are per month. Because you get a taste for a casino. Don't you want to go to a really nice one or at least a really weird one? The Strip in Vegas is great. So you habituate people to gambling, then they see an activity that they can center that holiday on. So the reality is, of course, and the reason people like Horgan made money in his old line of work is that everyone in the gambling industry does better if you create more gambling opportunities anywhere. It truly is a rising tide lifting all boats, except, of course, the finances of the people who are gaming.
Yep. No, that makes sense. That's a very socially conservative argument, Stuart. That's extremely socially conservative because that's basically the same argument that's made about pornography.
Absolutely. Well, this is why we're seeing all kinds of feminist organizations working for Boris Johnson's Tories, right? This is a very strange moment when the left has got so crazy that, people like me and like the head of Rape Relief are being slowly pushed onto the conservative side just by the sheer insanity of what's going on elsewhere. Fortunately, there's enough insanity on the conservative side we can, we can just keep ricocheting back and forth.
Exactly. It's like one of the things you had just written about in your blog, I think this is something that would be good for the viewers to kind of understand a bit, is this idea of how what went wrong with the left in the sense of harassment policy and how that broke down solidarity. Maybe we can walk through what even solidarity is first a little bit, and then we'll get to what's going on there.
Sure. Well, let me start with the starting point. The fact that it was 2 weeks ago on this show that I had the conversation that made me write my latest blog post, talking with Aaron Gunn. And there was this piece of a puzzle that I had been missing for a long time. And it had to do with the fact that it was primarily employers and not trade unions that came to the bargaining table with these beefed up anti-bullying, anti-bigotry, anti-harassment policies. And that trade unions looked at these policies pretty uncritically and went, well, this sort of looks like the anti-racism campaign we're out doing in the public square, so why not have something like this at work? And signed off with very little thought about it. But in fact, the negotiators for these corporations are actually far smarter and thinking a longer game than the union negotiators they were up against. Because the central problem of capitalism since the fall of the Soviet Union has been to get it back onto the track that it was on before the rise of the Soviet Union, where you have a huge gap between rich and poor, workers have very few rights, everything's being paid for on installment plans, and the economy is largely deregulated. Now, that's what makes profits, right? The more you can skim off and send to investors, the better your business is running. And so following the collapse of the Soviet Union, we went through this process called austerity, where both the private and public sector went, we need to shed employees, we need to become more efficient. How are we going to do that? And also, how do we get rid of these union protections of job security? How do we get to the point where we have at-will employment again and a
exempt
right-to-work
employees.
environment?
Yeah, exempt employees.
Yeah, so this how do you facilitate that? Well, one of the ways to do that is to start educating workers about, you both educate, and I use educate advisedly, you're educating workers supposedly about the evils of racism, the evils of sexism, the evils of bullying. But what you're really doing is the companies that come in and do this, and they're a whole industry, their methodology is not based on any recognizable pedagogy or educational principles. It's from 1970s cults like the Est movement becoming the Landmark Forum. So what you do is you accuse everybody in the room of being a racist, you make everybody feel bad, and then you have these personal confessions like Maoist self-criticism, except, of course, they're much more common in cults like Scientology, Landmark Forum, Est, etc. Somebody gets up, they cry, you destroy their ego in front of the group, and then you rebuild their ego in the context of the group. And the person goes, I'm going to be different now, blah, blah, blah. Now, of course, that's corrosive to solidarity. Of course, it makes people more focused on their work environment. But the other thing is these policies are not about people abusing their rank at work. It's not like we have a policy against harassment and you can use the fact that you're of a lower rank as grounds for why you're being harassed. No, being of a lower class or a lower rank is not a legit reason to file a complaint. What's a legit reason, and it's interesting how it's expressed, is if you feel that you're the subject of racism, if you feel you're the subject of sexism, if you feel you're the subject of transphobia or homophobia. Now, what that does is it delinks your complaint from any available evidence. So if you actually are, if you can show all these instances where you were called a racist name or something, and there's like a paper trail, that doesn't really make much difference because it's not about what's happened. It's about how you feel. And similarly, if you can't find any evidence, but you have some very strong feelings, that can count. And so what these complaint processes really are is a measure of how much social capital you have at work and how many friends you have at work. And you also have to look at, well, who do complaints get lodged against? Well, they don't tend to get lodged against one's superior because your superior has all of these new powers to punish you as corporations get more hierarchical, they have more managers, there's more surveillance, more people are watching you. So successful complaints tend to be directed against someone of equal or lower rank.
You can only punch down.
You could only punch down or across. And the consequences are obvious. People who lack social capital at work because they don't fit in, they're the people who are most likely to be targeted successfully in processes like this. Now, this has become married to the internet. And so one of the things that these policies typically don't do is they don't stipulate that you can only complain about people's activities at work. The fact that they exist at work and might do something you don't like outside of work becomes a grounds for you feeling like they're oppressing you.
Oh, no.
Feeling like they're being bigoted towards you. And so what this means is that effectively, everybody now has a morals clause in their contract that they have to engage in non-controversial speech outside of work, or they may be the victim of workplace discipline. And, this was spelled out to me pretty directly in my own recent interactions with a former employer. There's this moment of saying, well, but Dr. Parker was ill. Dr. Parker, you asked for all this medical documentation. Here it all is. It's like, and the employer says, well, it's not really about that, actually. It's about what he says on Twitter. And what's interesting is that in that process, while my employer is trying to get rid of me because they don't like my political opinions, the big social justice activist of campus immediately joins in attacking me, and echoing the employer's accusations against me that I'm a misogynist, that I'm sexist, blah, blah, blah. And what's going on in this guy's mind is that he's being a social justice warrior. He is doing the work of equity by chasing an evil misogynist out of the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, 100 years ago, he wouldn't have been called a social justice warrior. He would have been called a snitch or a scab, because what he's doing is volunteer work for the boss
Mm-hmm.
to help someone else get fired. And of course, this is the genius of how the human resources industry has turned the woke left into its weapons. What are the main demands? What were the main demands, right, against Harvey Weinstein? That Harvey Weinstein be fired, right? Those are the big demands that tend to get made when in this sort of cancel culture moment.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is that now, Mia Kirshner, a brilliant Canadian actress, wrote a piece rebutting all that during the Harvey Weinstein Me Too moment. She said, well, this isn't going to help anyone. There's just going to be another Harvey Weinstein in that position.
Mm-hmm.
What you want is for the Screen Actors Guild to prohibit people holding meetings in hotel rooms, people signing contracts without physical supervision.
Mm-hmm.
We need proper labor standards where SAG negotiates. We need to get rid of this two-tiered membership in the union where all the extras have no voting rights. And she enumerated all these structural changes that could prevent women from being sexually victimized in Hollywood. But those things went nowhere. I think Sarah Polley agreed with them because I think they're like neighbors in Toronto. But that was it. Everybody else is like, fire Weinstein, fire Spacey, find these individual guys and chase them out of work, which also reveals a really ugly assumption because, you know, I've said to the people who are after me, well, where am I supposed to work now?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you're not supposed to work. Well, where am I supposed to live? You're not supposed to live anywhere.
We'll give you a sign that says unclean.
Yeah. But actually what it means is, and of course they, you know, these folks, they go after your friends. They tell your friends not to associate with you. They, you know, and this is all
family.
about, yeah, they go after your family. And this is all supposedly about social justice.
Mm-hmm.
But their actual belief is that you don't deserve to live if you think the wrong thoughts, that the plan is not for you to be alive if you think the wrong thoughts. And this has come to replace what we used to call solidarity, which was that even if somebody is a dick at work, you stick up for them because you all have the same boss
Mm-hmm.
and you all collectively have the same interests. And you don't have to like the people who you share interests with. You can be annoyed by the fact that they leave work early and you have to cover for them. But at the end of the day, solidarity is a culture of shoring other people up, putting forward a common front, strengthening your workplace, making it a workplace where, yeah, there are still problems, but you're not in an environment where you wonder who is listening to your conversation, whether people are reading what you've said online, whether people know that you have a Reddit account. Because if you've got a bunch of people, and even if they all vote to go on strike together, they are not going to stick together when things get tough in the negotiations if they're all spying on each other and reporting each other. And we've turned these forms of surveillance from a moral failure into the very essence of social justice. And it's an amazing parlor trick. And a lot of people, you know, they blame the postmodernists or they blame the communists and all that nonsense.
The communists just wanted their beach vacations.
Yeah, exactly. All the communists are trying to do is go to the beach. All the postmodernists are trying to do is have like a contest to see how many words you can write before you get to a verb. Like these are like small things that people are doing at universities or in social clubs. The people who've created our so-called cancel culture moment, or what I'd prefer to call our neo-McCarthyism moment, are big HR. They're the people who expanded MBA programs in the 80s, 90s, and aughts, the people who created the executive MBA. These are the folks who are doing your workplace anti-racism training. Also, which is kind of inconvenient because they don't actually know anything about race or racism because they haven't studied it.
They're not usually from an unprivileged class either.
And that's the other thing about MBAs, right? Back when you hired specialized managers out of a bachelor's of business or a bachelor's of commerce, that's 4 years of full-time training. So if you had to have someone who was specialized in management, that used to be the degree. What's an MBA? It's 8 months of part-time training. But the tuition fees for an MBA are going to be the same or larger as for the 4-year program in commerce. So what you're doing is you're simply creating a financial gatekeeping function where a bunch of money goes into a university and a bunch of credentials come out the other end. Where are people actually learning their stuff? Well, it's like a mixture of like pop psychology, the 7 habits of highly effective people, things like that. And so the other thing is that we've gone from anti-racism being a reasonably intelligent discourse to a discourse that is dominated by a bunch of HR professionals who don't know anything about this subject. Now, the other thing that we've started seeing, though, are organizations like the one that went after those yoga studios in Boulder, Colorado. I don't know whether you're aware of this, but there were a group of people who were doing anti-racism training, but they were also a movement that put on anti-racism protests. And so it was a real carrot stick thing. So do you want to buy some anti-racism training? Are you sure? Because if you don't want to buy this product from us, we'll put on a protest and organize a boycott, and we will take you down.
That's called extortion.
That is. It's also, this is why Black Lives Matter Vancouver was expelled from the Black Lives Matter movement. The Chicago and New York BLM chapters just severed ties with Vancouver because it's actually mainly a theater ticket scalping business. If there's a black entertainer coming to town, BLM Vancouver approaches your venue and says, we're going to tell this person not to come because you're a racist organization, unless we get these dress circle tickets that we then resell. So, and this is catastrophic, right? Mainly for people who have to deal with racism in their daily lives. I was just reading the statistics. Unlike most racialized people, indigenous women, 96% of indigenous women who have been sexually assaulted by a non-indigenous person, right? Like, that is an incredibly clear statistical piece of information that this society has serious problems with racism. And the discourse about the racism that we're dealing with in this society has been hijacked by big HR to make people's jobs less secure rather than to fight racism. And all kinds of well-intentioned chumps have been taken in and are working to drive me out of employment, drive Aaron Ekman out of employment, drive whoever out of employment, instead of thinking about what can we do to actually address the significant issues of racism in our society that is literally killing our neighbors.
It's a profound statement, but not one I can disagree with. I think it's important that people hear it. Something that kind of bridges that gap a little bit, I think, Stuart, is that recently it was discussed, it was mentioned somewhere, that perhaps to solve some of the problems we're seeing in the armed forces in Canada, especially when it comes to sexual assault and that sort of thing, is that they should have a union. And I sat there and I was kind of like, oh, that's interesting, because I mean, one wouldn't think of rankers having a union being a very good way to fight a war. But then again, you have to look back to the Civil War in Spain, and the anarchists managed to put up a pretty good fight without having any proper ranks. I mean, Orwell documents that pretty well.
And you can also do it in, you don't have to turn the army into a co-op, which is what's going on in Kurdistan, what was going on in Spain. You don't have to turn the army into an anarchist co-op. We're not even saying the officers have to join the union. The point is that the folks on the bottom have some kind of collective representation. And in many ways, I think American voting patterns have gotten out right ahead of that. One of the things that I found most interesting was it used to be that you could rely on people at all ranks in the US Army to back the Republicans as the national security party. And then a really interesting thing happened, the Ron Paul presidential bids. Now, Ron Paul's an ambivalent figure, right? I really disagree with him on a bunch of stuff. But Ron Paul sought the Republican nomination on a ticket of letting you come home.
Yeah. And the war.
And a huge swing took place amongst not the officer class, but the regular enlisted men. And they were these bases on foreign soil were the only places that Ron Paul swept in his presidential bids. And ironically, the person who inherited those voters was Bernie Sanders.
Mm-hmm.
That Ron Paul ended up functioning as this conduit from a group of people who thought the officers were looking after them, thought their party was looking after them, to a group of people who were very strategically making radical voting decisions in a fairly cohesive way. This isn't the story of the fragmentation of the military vote. This is the story of the fragmentation of the U.S. military vote becoming more self-conscious and more sophisticated. And that's something that Scott Costin, who advocated for this, he comes out of the Canadian Forces. He says the Canadian Forces are ready for that. The problem is that we need to find different institutional mechanisms to galvanize the folks enlisted in the Army. Because if you want a story about race and being alive, the disproportionate representation of indigenous, but especially Métis people at the rank of private is huge. And we really have to think about how decisions are made for those folks and how their interests diverge from the officers' interests or from the strategic interests of the state. So it's not something that one can induce from outside the military, but I think it would be, my hope is that the parts of the Canadian trade union movement that aren't completely useless will get behind and put real resources into a rank and file led effort in the Canadian Forces. And I think we'll see, it'll be very interesting to see what the grievances and priorities are, how much this focuses on veterans care, how much this focuses on questions of promotion and race. There's a lot to unpack there. And it's unfortunate that the trade union movement often feels so beholden to the anti-war movement that it's tough to ask those questions and it's tough to send those organizers.
That is a difficult, interesting complication. One of maybe the last thing to touch on here with this whole idea is that when it comes to the military, just like other institutions, used to be a way of people from the lower classes making their way into upper classes, or at least finding some kind of equity. And maybe that's something else that's changed. But it's interesting, too, because it's not as if different races or different cultures weren't mixed in the military before. Case in point being, I mean, the English were very happy to bring the Scottish into their ranks. That's how they took Quebec. And if we look at America, I mean, despite only having less than 25% of the population, most of the rankers and a lot of the U.S. military comes from the southern United States, which still has an honor-based culture. So what has gone wrong here? And I mean, I think it's the same thing in Canada. I think there is very much an honor-based culture inside of Aboriginal and Métis organizations. So that's being funneled into the military to help bolster it. What is going on? Why isn't that resulting in those old ways of the institution leveling people up?
Yeah, I think it's. I think that one of the problems is stigma. I think that a lot of folks that there isn't this sense in white collar employment that people who've come up through the military are people whose organizational skills, their morality, all of these things have been forged in the military. Instead, we go, well, this person had to serve in the military, so there's already something wrong. We also really overdo it when we talk about trauma. Now, I'm not saying that our veterans hospital system treats trauma as well as it should, but we often imagine people who've done military service as permanently damaged and as like damaged goods that you shouldn't handle. And I think it's really great that we've raised awareness about post-traumatic stress disorder and things like that and disabilities that you do get from being in the military. But I think what's happened now is there's a stigma in terms of, well, you either served in the military because you're a chump or you have bad politics.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, you probably have a whole bunch of mental illnesses I don't want to see. And that, of course, is, and it's funny. We think that the left has a big sensitivity culture, and certainly we're very sensitive about certain things. But veterans are one of the groups that you can just disparage, that you can just look down your nose at, that you can just say mean things about with no consequences. Nobody's going to stick up for a veteran's feelings in the left any more than they're going to stick up for the feelings of someone who says, I'm born again in Jesus Christ, right? We love people getting to pick their identity unless they pick that one. And we love stories of resilience unless resilience involves clawing your way up through the military to make something of yourself. So I think that a lot of white collar employment turns up their nose, and right now I'm watching Mad Men with my partner and her daughter. And there's a scene in Mad Men where they're watching a Western, and I realized that we are as far in time from Mad Men as they were from the Western they're watching in the show.
That's right.
But you think back to that era, and you think of the fact that this is what demobilization looked like. It looked like veterans coming and taking jobs and being accommodated for the fact that they were traumatized. You see that all through Mad Men. You see a lot of excuse making, both good and bad, for the veterans. But you also see tremendous respect for the skills they acquired and what they achieved. And it's really the 1960s, by the time you're at the end of the 1960s, liberal society's idea of respecting veterans disappears. And it really saddened me. One of the most saddening things for me about the Trump movement was seeing the right adopt that same scorn, hearing Donald Trump mocking. There's a lot to mock about John McCain, but the fact that he spent time in a prisoner of war camp is sure as hell not it. The idea that McCain was a chump for having served, the idea that, he was dumb for having been captured, that he was unintelligent in not selling out his guys when he was in the camp. It's really disappointing stuff. And it's really sad to see that scorn that incubated in the left-wing anti-war movement is now spreading through all parts of society, including among people I never thought would have that kind of disrespect for people's military service. My partner's ex, he served in Kosovo.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm obviously, the kids know what kind of person I am. And, the fact that, I've been to my share of peace marches and blah, blah, blah. And I said, I want to make really clear here that your father deciding to serve in Kosovo was a service to me. It was a service to all people. Kosovo, if there is any war that we can call a good war after the Second World War, it is the fight to protect those Muslim civilians in Kosovo and in Bosnia. And yet, people don't think about that. The anti-war movement went out and protested Kosovo, just like everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really unfortunate that we're not thinking. We also don't ask questions about what specifically did you do in the forces. Oh, you had a quartermaster's spot. Oh, really? So you're a bookkeeper. You're an accountant. You can do all these things. People, they stop asking questions when they hear military service rather than that being an opener to questions. So I think that we, the number one reason, this is not as true in Canada, but it's more true than you think. Number one reason given for people enlisting in the U.S. Army is to have medical coverage for their wife's first pregnancy.
Hmm.
There are not just good foreign motivations to join the forces, there are good domestic motivations to join, to lift your family out of poverty, to provide them with new housing, these sorts of things. And I think we're at an unfortunate moment when we lose the ability to respect that, because it goes back to this larger question we keep asking about the efforts to assert ourselves as a people in Western Canada. You need a big coalition. You need to welcome everyone in. And especially in rural, racialized communities, especially in Métis communities, that has to mean honoring our veterans in a different and more substantive way.
I completely agree. Well, we have come to the end of our time. It was a little bit different today. Obviously, we had an in-house guest. It's been a little while since we've done that. I think the last time we did that, Sean Olick was on stand, but that's okay. And thank you for your patience with us, and thank you for letting us rearrange things during that one little minute we took there. But I just want to say thank you so much, Stuart, for being here. It's always an honor to have you on the show, and we love having you here.
Well, thanks so much. I finally feel like I'm talking to the people that I should have been talking to all along.
Oh, there you go. That's perfect. Well, that's our show for this week. And of course, we'll be back on Tuesday, 9 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Mountain. And we'll be bringing on some more guests. We'll be announcing those through the weekend. Again, thank you for tuning in. And this has been Mountain Standard Time.